Greetings from Phoenix, Arizona on this beautiful December 30th, 2015. This is Tony E. Denton. I'd like to share a few thoughts with you on Matthew chapter 13, verses 36 through 43, but we will begin with verses 24 through 30. One of the numerous illustrations Jesus related in his ministry goes like this in the New King James Version. The kingdom of heaven is like a man who sowed good seed in his field, but while men slept, his enemy came and sowed tares among the wheat and went his way. But when the grain had sprouted and produced a crop, then the tares also appeared. So the servants of the owner came and asked him, Sir, did you not sow good seed in your field? Why then does it have tares? He said to them, An enemy has done this. The servant said to him, Do you want us to go and gather them up? But he said, No, lest while you gather up the tares, you also uproot the wheat with them. Let both grow together until the harvest, and at the time of the harvest I will say to the reapers, First gather together the tares, and bind them in bundles to burn them, then gather the wheat into my barn. Now after this story was told, some of Jesus' disciples asked him for an explanation. So he replied with the following. He who sows the good seed is the Son of Man. The field is the world, and the good seed are the sons of the kingdom. But the tares are the sons of the wicked one. The enemy who sowed them is the devil. The harvest is the end of the age, and the reapers are the angels. Therefore, as the tares are gathered and burned in the fire, so it will be at the end of this age. The Son of Man will send out his angels, and they will gather out of his kingdom all things that offend, and those who practice lawlessness, and they'll be cast into the furnace of fire. There will be wailing and gnashing of teeth. Then the righteous will shine forth as the sun in the kingdom of their Father. That's verses 36 through 43. So, Jesus, in this passage, in this explanation, defined or equated the Christ with the sower, the devil with the enemy, the world with the field, the children of the kingdom with the seed, the children of the enemy with the tares, the angels with the reapers, and the end of this age with the harvest. Now before getting in depth in the study of this parable's explanation, let's lay some groundwork. The speaker is Jesus, who Matthew has already put forth in his account of the gospel as the promised Messiah. Number 1, in chapter 1, he referred to the virgin birth of Jesus and how that an angel told Jesus' earthly father Joseph that his bride's child was of the Spirit of God and thus the promised Messiah. Number 2, in chapter 3, he told the story of how Jesus' cousin John the Baptist preached of Jesus as being the prophesied Messiah. Number 3, in chapter 4, Matthew wrote of Jesus' temptation by the arch-enemy who referred to him as the Son of God. Number 4, in chapter 8, he narrated the story of a demon-possessed man who spoke of Jesus as the Son of God. Number 5, in chapter 11, he wrote of Jesus as answering in the affirmative when asked if he were the Messiah. Number 6, in chapter 12, the inspired writer Matthew referred to Jesus as being the one who would raise from the dead after 3 days, as well as strip all power from the arch-enemy. With all that in mind, chapters 1 through 12, who did Jesus say the sower was? Right, Jesus Christ himself. The audience was comprised of Jesus' own Jewish Israelite brethren. For, as he stated in chapter 10, verse 6, they were the ones to whom he was sent and the ones to whom he came. Check out John 1:11. In fact, in verse 36 of the parable of the tares in the field, which we call this in Matthew 13, it specifically states that the Jewish men Jesus chose earlier, those listed in chapter 10, came to him asking him to explain the parable to them. Now, if one wishes for even more proof of who comprised the audience of Matthew 13 parables, all he or she has to do is check out the contexts of the 2 Old Testament prophetic passages quoted in Matthew 13, namely verses 12, 15, and 35. With all this in mind, what did Jesus say the field was? Right, the world. Oh, you don't see the connection? Okay. Then let's start out our in-depth study of this parable by talking about the world. Before talking about the original term for world in Matthew 13:38, and by the way, world is an acceptable translation here, let's talk about the English term world for a moment. We, and even those of Jesus' time, use the term world in numerous ways. Number 1, the universe. Number 2, planet or Earth, planet Earth. Number 3, all peoples of planet Earth. Number 4, peoples of a division of planet Earth, such as the Western world. Number 5, an ethnic people of planet Earth, such as the African world. Number 6, a government of people of planet Earth, such as the democratic world. Number 7, a class of people scattered about planet Earth, such as the intellectual world. Number 8, a religious type of people of planet Earth, such as the Muslim world. Or number 9, an individual's sphere of existence, such as my world. Think about that. There are at least 9 ways in which we use the term world today. So when Jesus said the field of his parable represented the world, how should we interpret that? Well, it seems logical to me to keep it within the context of when Jesus was speaking and to whom he was speaking. In other words, what they would have likely understood by his use of this word as he was addressing them. So with that in mind, since this was a Jew speaking to a group of his Jewish brethren in a time before life as they knew it ended 40 years later, I extraordinarily tend to think they understood, or at the very least Jesus thought they'd understand, the phrase the world to have reference to their world, the world of Israel, God's old covenant people, who weren't just a people based on bloodline, but also a people or a world based on government. In this case, an administration headed up by God, thus a theocratic government. Intriguingly, not only did Yahweh call Israel his vineyard several times, but he also considered Israel his field. In fact, in Jeremiah 12 verse 10, we find those two terms actually used interchangeably. The New American Standard Bible has Yah saying to Jeremiah that many shepherds or rulers have ruined my vineyard. They have trampled down my field. They have made my pleasant field a desolate wilderness or a desert. Here's what's really interesting about that statement in Jeremiah 12 verse 10. The Hebrew actually reads more like the RSV, Revised Standard Version, which states, shepherds have trampled down my portion of land. They've made my pleasant portion of land a desolate wilderness. So God was saying to Jeremiah that out of all peoples, the Israelites were his. Israel was his piece of the pie, or land, or field to cultivate. In fact, the Greek word for field is agros, from which, of course, our word agriculture is derived. So what's my point? Well, personally, I'm convinced that in his parable of the tares in the field, Jesus, by his use of the words field and world, was referring to national Israel, for the world of Israel was God's field. Let's put this into perspective a little bit here. In verse 24, Jesus said that the kingdom of heaven is like a man who sowed good seed in his field, that is, his portion of land. And he said that that man, that sower, was Jesus himself. Thus it's about his task of bringing about the kingdom of heaven on earth, as mentioned in the model prayer in Matthew 6. Then in verse 38 he said that the field, that is his, Christ's portion of land or people on earth, verse 24, is equal to the world. Thus, his world is equal to a portion of land or people, not all lands, not all peoples, for the purpose of creating the kingdom of redemption. Yes, the kingdom of redemption came through who? The Jews, John 4:24. Salvation is of the Jews. It was their world. A Jew speaking to Jews about their world, what was happening to them at the time, or what's about to get ready to happen to them at the time. So although we'll have to wait to get to the timing part of this a little later, specifically relative to the point of this parable and within the parameters of the error involved in this parable, namely from when Jesus said all this to the end of that age, verses 39 and 40, Israel, which by the way was strewn throughout the Roman Empire, was the field or the world in which Jesus, through his disciples, would plant his seed of the kingdom. So now, just with that part right there that we've just discussed, you should go back and read the parable and the explanation. Just with that, just getting into our minds who was speaking and to whom he was speaking makes a big difference on how we apply this passage. Because I myself used to apply this passage in a completely different way, based on the way I always heard it, traditionalism, and so on. But it's amazing how much it helps just to figure out audience relevance, just to figure out who was speaking and to whom he was speaking, and when that was in historical time frame and all of that. In the previous list of the ways the term world is used that I gave you, instead of world number 3, namely all peoples of planet Earth, being what was meant by the world in this parable, it's much more reasonable that Jesus was referring mainly to a combination of world number 6, namely a people under a government, and world number 8, namely a religious group of people, the Israelite world. Oh, before we move on past this, let's not forget to get back to a few thoughts on the original term for world, which is the Greek word cosmos. We say cosmos with a C-O-S-M-O-S. This is cosmos, K-O-S-M-O-S. Same word. We get cosmos from cosmos, but that's the way it's spelled in the Greek. It's K-O-S-M-O-S, and it's both of those O's are omicron, so it's cosmos. As Western folk in the 21st century, we tend to think only of the universe when we hear or use the word cosmos. But such wasn't the case on the other side of the planet in the days of Jesus Christ, 2,000 years ago. It was actually employed as a term of beauty, of something of a very well-ordered arrangement. Both the Collins and World English dictionaries, which, by the way, agree with Strong's definition of cosmos, define cosmos as an ordered system and the opposite of chaos. Okay, there you go. Cosmos is ordered, chaos is unordered. And what else is a better ordered system than the theocratic government of God over his religious people Israel via the perfect law of Moses? Yes, it was perfect. The people couldn't live it because it was perfect and people are not. Incidentally, the word cosmetician is synonymous with, that's right, beautician. See? Ordered beauty. Cosmos, to the people during the time of Jesus Christ, referred to ordered beauty, an ordered system of beauty. But as we read in Jeremiah 12 verse 10, God's old covenant world or people, God's field, had become ugly and hostile toward him, the farmer. According to Hebrews 6 verse 7, yes, God's the farmer. His name is George. So his new covenant people, the remnant of old covenant Israel, became his field to cultivate and beautify, 1 Corinthians 3 verse 9. Oh, you're wondering why I said George? The Greek word in Hebrews 6 verse 7 is George. So God, the farmer, the word George means farmer. So God's name is George in that sense. That's all I was saying. It's interesting. Just go check it out. In fact, you can find more about that in my book on Hebrews called Hebrews Fulfilled, From Flawed to Flawless, Fulfilled. Now, since we know Christ is the sower and that Israel, all 12 tribes of her, throughout the empire was the field, who were the sons of the kingdom? That's easy, right? Christians. Jesus, via the Spirit and his original disciples, was planting seed that sprouted into Christians all over the Israelite world, throughout the Roman Empire. These folks were spoken of as the remnant, or the church, the called out ones, from among the so-called lost tribes of Israel. Just check out Romans 11 verse 5 and other passages like that. The remnant were those people who were called out of the Israelite world that was spread all over the Roman Empire. The church, the called out, were the remnant. That remnant was called out primarily by the Apostle Paul and those who worked with him and throughout the Roman Empire. Peter was to the Jews, Paul was to those outside of Judea. He was calling out. It's time, as Jesus talked about in John chapter 10, they would hear his voice and they would come through the Apostle Paul. They heard the voice of Jesus and they accepted Jesus as the Messiah, or those who did at least, were the remnant, who became the church that then was married to Jesus Christ. The remnant was therefore fulfilled during the time of the first generation of Christians. That gets off into a whole other subject, but it's an interesting one. And you can email me, TEDENTON64@hotmail.com if you want to talk about that sometime, TEDenton64@hotmail.com, or find me on Facebook or whatever. Next we ask the question, who were the sons of the enemy? Well, just as the children of the kingdom were God's or Christ's people, so the children of the enemy were the enemy's people. So we must move on and ask the question, who was the enemy? Well, Jesus said the enemy was the devil, but we still need more explanation, or at least I do. The original term for enemy means exactly that, an adversary, an enemy, a foe, and the original term for devil is the word from which we get diabolical, and it refers to a false accuser, a defamer, a slanderer, an adversary. So the enemy in this story is the one who works against and slanders the name of Christ and his people to the authorities and perhaps even the God himself. So one can't help but recall the story of Job, in which the incident is told of how Satan, which when translated instead of transliterated as a proper name means enemy, approached God and defamed his man Job and his family. The thing is, if we think of Satan there as a metaphysical being in Job, he didn't do things to Job on his own. Rather, he used the Sabaeans, the Chaldeans, so-called friends, and other people against Job and his family. No, read Job again. Nothing is stated as from Satan himself. He used people. People were the ones who were Job's enemies, the Sabaeans, Chaldeans, and his so-called friends and so on. The same applies in the case of Jesus' parable. The enemy or the devil, if a supernatural being, used his minions who were strategically placed throughout the Israelite people in attempts to do everything possible to thwart the cause of the Christ. Again, the enemy of Christ, according to Philippians 3 and Revelation 2 and 9 and Revelation 3 and 9 and other passages, like Luke 19:12 and following, was the Jewish body. The body of the Jews who rejected Christ. They were the enemy. And we'll get more into that later, probably. So who then again were the sons of the enemy? The Jews who rejected Jesus the Messiah. The same Greek term translated enemy in this parable is the same one found in what's called the parable of the Minas in Luke 19 that I just mentioned, 12 through 27, in which Jesus said to the Jews, "Bring here those enemies of mine who didn't want me to reign over them and slay them before me." Verse 27. By the way, pretty much everyone agrees that this story, like the one in Matthew 22, 1 and following, is a reference to God's annihilation of Jerusalem and thus Judaism. The same Greek term for enemy is also found in Philippians 3:18, in which Paul, speaking of these same rejecting Jews, verse 2, wrote, "They are the enemies of the cross of Christ." One specific case of this is found in Acts 13, verse 10, in which Paul said to a Jew by the name of Elymas, "You full of deceit and enemy of all righteousness, will you not cease perverting the straight ways of the Lord?" Compare that with 1 Thessalonians 2:14 through 16, which we won't go to. There are also verses like the following which should be consulted in a study of the true enemy of Christ and his people while the bride church was being prepared. Galatians 2:4 speaks of false brethren. Compare that with Acts 15:1 and 24. 2 Peter 2 verse 1 that speaks of false teachers. Jude 4 that speaks of certain ones who crept in unnoticed. And then Revelation 2:9 and 3:9 that I mentioned a moment ago that speak of these same infiltrating pernicious Jews as being of the synagogue of Satan, which again means adversary. Now, when you look at all these passages and others, like in Hebrews, there are quite a few of them, it's difficult to not see that the enemy that's talked about most of the time, the Satan that's spoken about most of the time in the New Covenant scriptures, was the rejecting Jews, the Christ-rejecting Jewish body. Let me add this. I believe both Satan and Job and the devil in this parable, Matthew 13, represent not some evil spirit being, but the enemy as a singular corporate body of those who rejected Christ. And that is reminiscent of the leaders of the Jews and their cronies in Jeremiah 12, verse 10. Now, before we can summarize the meaning of this parable, the only thing, and probably the most important thing, left to figure out is the harvest of verses 30 and 39. Since we're 2,000 years removed from this story, to get a truly accurate grasp on this parable, we must determine what the Lord meant by the phrase, "this age," in verse 40, so we can at least narrow down the timing of this harvest event in hopes, of course, of figuring out what he meant by it. And by the way, out of the 7 things Jesus defined, I find it intriguing that the harvest is the only one that he did not personify. Think about that. Jesus equated himself with the sower, the devil with the enemy, the world with the field, the children of the kingdom with the seed, the children of the enemy with the tares, the angels with the reapers, but he simply referred to the end of this age as the harvest. He used personification throughout the first 6 of them until he got to the harvest. This harvest is going to be a little more difficult for us to figure out. Let's get to work on that here. In verse 39, Jesus identified the time for this harvest by the phrase, "the end of the age." Then in verse 40, he identified which age he meant with the phrase, "the end of this age." You ever caught that one before? Since there are versions with "the age" in both verses, let me share the following with you, because I know that's what's going to come up. People say, "Whoa, my version says 'the age' in both those verses." Well, let's talk about that. There are around 5,000 manuscripts of either parts or all of the Greek New Testament, and due to so many extant manuscripts, there's also a Greek text which was created and has been utilized by translations with the pronoun "this" in verse 40 called the majority text. It's called the majority text because it's a compilation of what the majority of the manuscripts record in regard to any given statement in the New Testament. So this is obviously why I found approximately 40 versions which translate Jesus as saying that the harvest of verse 30 was slated to occur at the end of this age, verse 40. That is, that age nearly 2,000 years ago now, the age in which he and his audience were then living. Remember again, Jesus, a Jew, speaking to the Jews, who of course have not existed, biblically speaking, since the destruction of Jerusalem 2,000 years ago, talking to them, and he says, the harvest would occur at this age, the end of this age. Something else important is this. As an example, on Bible-researcher.com, there are 12 Greek texts of the New Testament. Interestingly, 6 of them include the pronoun "this," while the other 6 do not. So what do I do in that kind of a case? Well, the following scenario makes a lot of sense to me. If I come across 2 different versions or 2 different translations with ancient Greek texts supporting both of them, I need to ask myself the following. Should I devise my own explanation of the statement under consideration? Or should I allow the more specific text to make sense of the less specific text? Clearly, I should do the latter. Right? Yes, I should take the more specific text to make sense of the less specific text. Surely then, this means that in the majority of the approximately 5,000 ancient Greek manuscripts of what we call the New Testament, the pronoun "this" is found as a modifier of the noun "age" in Matthew 13:40. Okay, now that we've narrowed down the age to this age, that is, the age in which Jesus made the statement, the age in which Jesus and his audience of that day were living, we must ask, exactly what or whose age was this? Well, to whom was he speaking? Again, I'm just kind of repeating myself here, I guess, a little bit, but to his religious, Abrahamic, Mosaic brethren, the Jews, from among whom the salvation of the Messiah was to come, John 4:22. Okay, consider this. God's old covenant, Abrahamic, Mosaic people, lived in the belief of 2 ages. The age before Messiah's accomplished work, and the age of the Messiah's accomplished work. Jesus even appealed to this, or their, belief earlier that day in Matthew 12, verse 32. You might even check out Ephesians 1:21. At this point in time, hardly any of God's Old Covenant people believed Jesus was the Messiah, much less that he had come and accomplished the work prophesied of him. Besides, 20 years later, Paul reminded the Christians of Galatia that Jesus was born under the law, Galatians 4:4. The law being, of course, equivalent to the Old Covenant. Jesus, in fact, according to Paul again later in Hebrews 9:26, wasn't only born under the law, but he also died near the end of the age of the law. Now, I'm not sure I know anyone who disputes that Jesus lived and died under the Old Covenant, for his cross nails were the death nails of the Old Covenant. Romans 10 verse 4, Christ is the end or the consummation of the law. So when Jesus said that the harvest with the reapers of the angels and so on would be in this age, he's talking about the age in which he was born and died under, the Old Covenant age. One quick side note is the import of the full meaning of the Greek word for end here, as well as in every other related passage. The Greek word for end in Matthew 13 is from suntelia, which doesn't just refer to a mere end of something like a rope, but to a consummation or accomplishment of a purposefully worked toward goal. Just keep that in mind. When you see the word end in the New Testament, it's practically always the word that has to do with a goal that has been reached or is being reached for. So when Jesus affirmed in the parable of the tares in the field that the harvest would transpire at the end of this age, he was referring to the end of the Old Covenant age. And when did their age, their world, and the Old Covenant or the law of Moses end? Well, we'll get to that momentarily. We must move on to the meaning of the harvest in order to help us with that question in this particular context. So now, what did Jesus mean by the harvest? Whatever was meant by it, Jesus here placed it not only at the end of the Old Covenant age, as is also found in numerous other places in the Bible, especially the New Testament, but he also implied it was to be an event that included angels and their task at that point to accomplish a once-for-all time fire cleansing of the kingdom from offensive things and offensive people, resulting in wailing and gnashing of teeth. Matthew 13, 39 through 42 or so. Check out Ezekiel 22, 17 through 22, in which the Lord referred to his rebellious ones drying in the furnace of Jerusalem when it was taken by the Babylonians. Also check out Matthew 22 and 7, in which Jesus spoke of the burning up of the city. Now, let's look at the other side of the coin in this situation. Since the harvest with its angels, fire and wailing, etc., was to be at the end of the law of Moses, which according to Jesus in Matthew 5, 17, 18 couldn't end until every jot until a prophecy was fulfilled, then the consummation of the law was a time of harvest, separation, involving angels, fire, wailing, etc. See, just like the word judgment, the word harvest means separation. You're separating the good stuff from the bad. Jesus went on in Matthew 13, 47 through 50 to refer even more clearly to this event. We should also note his strong, to-the-point words to Jewish leaders in Luke 3, 26 and following, which is reminiscent of Matthew 3, 7 through 12. You don't have time to go into all that, but you can look that up yourself and compare those passages. This story wasn't about the end of the Christian age or the New Covenant age, as I was always taught and what I taught myself. Again, Matthew 13, the parable of the tares in the field are not about the end of the Christian age, not about the end of the New Covenant age. Rather, it was about the purpose of the age of the Old Covenant, the goal of which was to give birth to or to produce the redemptive age of the New Covenant. Speaking of produce, the noun produce is a synonym for harvest. Also, you may find it interesting to know that there's no Bible prophecy of the end of time, but there are plenty of Bible prophecies about the time of the end. Check out Daniel 12 verse 4 and Daniel 12 verse 9. It's talking about the time of the end, that is, the end of prophecy fulfillment. The end when God's redemptive plan was consummated and accomplished through Israel and her old covenant mode of existence. Not the end of the planet Earth. That doesn't even fit the context of Jesus' parable. Now, speaking of Daniel, something to help us with our understanding of this harvest is right here in what Jesus said. In Matthew 13:43, he echoed Daniel 12 verse 3. So let's allow the Bible to explain itself. After Jesus spoke of the harvest, which he called a gathering in verse 41, by the way, he said, "Then the righteous will shine forth as the sun in their Father's kingdom." Likewise, after the angel spoke to Daniel in 12 verse 2 about what? That's right, the judgmental separation of resurrection, which equals the gathering out of the kingdom, he then said that those who are wise will shine like the heavens, and those, the sons of the kingdom, who turn many to righteousness will shine like the stars forever and ever. Wow. Taking Daniel 12 verse 3 and its context into consideration in Matthew 13's parable, since Jesus brought Daniel up, sure helps us to figure this out, doesn't it? Harvest, the produce, comes from the resurrection, according to Daniel. And that resurrection was going to be when the time of the sons of the kingdom would shine. And according to Daniel 12 verse 7, it's even better. Think about this. What point in time did the angel inform Daniel this would happen? Verse 7, when the power of the holy people has been completely shattered, all these things shall be accomplished. And when was the power of God's old covenant people finally completely shattered? Verse 11 goes on to cite the time when the daily sacrifices would be taken away at the abomination of desolation, which Jesus in his Olivet Discourse in Matthew 24:15 declared would occur at the destruction of Jerusalem with its temple, its priesthood, and its sacrifices. When did the sacrifices stop? AD 70, destruction of Jerusalem. Have they started up again? No. So, Daniel 12 verse 7 is talking about the destruction of AD 70. Daniel 12 verse 7 is the answer to Daniel's question about when would these things happen. What things? Verse 2, the resurrection. Verse 3, the shining of God's true righteous people as the stars of heaven forever and ever. So to summarize, in the parable of the tares of the field, Jesus was simply foretelling the story of the growth and the final establishment of his kingdom on earth over the next 40-year period with all of its persecutions, tribulations, and martyrdom. But, as is also taught in other parables, the Lord King himself would come in the events of AD 70 to remove every vestige of the world of Judaism and the law of bondage, along with its opposition toward the world of Christianity and its law of liberty in Christ, thereby proving to Israel once and for all that God's true people, those of Daniel 7:22, are the shining followers and disciples of Jesus of Nazareth. Thank you for your time. Any questions or comments? You're welcome to send them to me at tedenton64@hotmail.com, or check out my website and get a hold of me through the website, a site, S-I-T-E, for F-O-R, the Lord, a site for the Lord.com.